Okay, so I figured out how I'm going to mount my electric motor. Template. Always make a template out of cardboard. It's a lot cheaper to screw up on cardboard than it is on sheet plate. Right, metal's expensive. So how I'm going to mount this guy, these two holes right here are going to be actually sandwiched between the e-brake handle and its mount. So that's going to leave my plate like this. And then my electric motor will mount behind it like so. And then at first I was thinking of making a tab on the end that bends in to go meet the firewall and breaks off the firewall to give it some more strength. But this plate is not exactly straight up and down. It's a slight forward angle. So figuring out the compound angles between the two is a little bit tricky. And at the same time, if I made the compound angle, that means that when I actually put it in 2D to draw it on my plate, this arm would have to go back at a very steep angle, which would take up a lot more room on my plate. Again, steel is expensive. So I decided instead to add just a little tab. I'm going to fold this little tab on the side and make the bracket in two parts. Like I said, it's a lot cheaper to fix cardboard than to fix steel. So once I have this one made, I'm probably going to add a few more lightning holes, make it look pretty. I will be able to mount this one in place and then use another piece of cardboard to figure out exactly what that brace looks like and do it in two parts. And at the same time, when I cut my brace, I can just put it along the edge of my sheet, cut the proper angle at the end, and once it bolts together, Bob your uncle. So let's get that done.
A little longer than a few minutes later.
Okay, this took entirely too long, so let me tell you about the couple of problems I ran into. So when I made my plate to mount my electric motor to the handbrake mounting bracket, plate went in fine, but then when I went to put the motor behind it, it was actually too high. The motor was interfering with the cowl, so I had to lower the entire thing. Luckily, my bracket was wide enough that I could just drill two new holes higher up so that I could lower the entire thing, mount the motor. Everything worked out good. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Lowering the motor now meant that the pivot to the electric motor was lower than the pivot point on that lever we made on our vacuum motor. And to add insult to injury, that electric motor actually spins counterclockwise, which means that when it leaves the park position, it is swinging downward, which means that instead of swinging, if it's lower than the lever on our vacuum motor, instead of swinging across, it's actually pushing upward, which could cause it to bind. So the simple solution to that one would be to extend our lever on our vacuum motor, right? So that actually lowers it back down to lower the electric motor center pivot. Problem solved. Wrong. If you remember from before, if I lengthen that lever when I swing, I'm further out than I was before. And from before, I showed you that that's where the defrost duct wants to be. Also, to add insult to injury again, that electric motor, turns out it's not for an 03, 09 Kia Sorento. After trying for a while to wire that guy in, I looked at the connector end use online. It had nothing to do with the one I have. And the only part number on that wiper motor was a handwritten part number with a Sharpie. That was the actual Kia Sorento part number. So I looked on the wiper motor everywhere. The only thing I could find was a sticker of the maker of the wiper motor, the brand of the wiper motor. So I went to their website, and actually, luckily, their website actually had pictures of all the motors that they offer. So I found, after a few minutes of Google research, that wiper motor is actually an electric 2-speed motor from an 87 Grumman. You know, those weird delivery trucks that are being recycled as food trucks now, right? So, works great for me. And the funny thing about that is that the website from the manufacturer actually had the MSRP for that motor. And the guy that lied to me on eBay actually sold it for about 1/3 of what that motor's worth. So, joke's on you. So like I said, making this guy longer actually interferes with the defrost duct. So after trying a couple of different setups, like temporary setups, to see if I could change the geometry in any way possible, I had no other way of doing it. So out came the defrost duct, and then I decided to extend it. So that would actually move the air inlet on the opposite side of that center brace behind the dash. So to do so, I just took the spot where it is the straightest and the narrowest, making the part easier. I've cut it there and I extended it 3 inches. And in order to extend it, I just bent a little piece of sheet metal. I actually made the piece long. I made it 4 inches long, and then I overlapped it 1/2 inch on each side instead of butt welding it. It's under the dash where nobody's ever going to see it anyway, so it doesn't have to look pretty. And I decided to weld it on the inside rather than the outside because, again, there's so much stuff in the way there that's trying to occupy the same real estate. I figured that if I welded it on the inside, I wouldn't cause any interference. I wouldn't have to dress the welds, and actually, if I don't dress the welds, I'm thinking that the bumps from my bubblegum welding will probably cause some excess turbulence that will help distribute the air better to give you a more efficient defrost function. Now, extending this guy creates its own sets of problems. My mounting point went from here to here, right? 3 inches more that way, which these are just mounted with screws directly through the dash. So I could have just drilled a new hole to match my mounting point, but that would make it unevenly spaced, and it's right there on the dash for everyone to see, so that would have looked ridiculous. So instead I chose to make a new bracket that covered the original vent, drill my new hole in the factory location so it would register with that screw. And since I was going to have to do a plate anyways, what I did is I made it a little extra long because now my dock is way too far towards the passenger side. So I made my plate a little extra long and I bent the front part of it so that it now creates a flat that helps redistribute the air towards the driver's side so it actually goes to the defrost. So hopefully that clears up all of our problems. As far as the wiring goes for our 2-speed motor, if you guys are dealing with this, you want to put an electric motor in your vehicle, you guys can pause the video. I'll put an image here of how it's wired. Just remember that wiper motors use quite a bit of amperage. A lot of them are on a 25 amp fuse. So your wire gauge has to be big enough to carry the load, and the switch you use has to be good enough to carry the load, or else you have to use the switch to trigger relays and let the relays carry the load, right? Speaking of switch, there's a lot of companies that offer universal kits and they use like a switch for their universal wiper kit. If you want to buy just the switch, it's usually like, from what I could find, was about $20, $25. I actually found that there's a 4-season switch for a HVAC blower motor for a Freightliner. I'll put the part number down here. That you can buy, that's actually made, that can carry 25 amps, works perfectly for that application. It's about half the money. What can I say? I'm a cheapskate. So again, let's mount everything in place. Hopefully the geometry works and we'll have a working setup. If everything works, I can take it apart one last time, make everything look pretty, put it back in, and we'll be done with the wipers. Okay, now we're going to have to figure out that second part of our bracket, right? I said working with compound angles is a little complicated. So we're going to use a trick, same trick that surveyors use on the side of the road, right? You know, surveyor's the guy that looks through that thingy, and the other guy over there that's holding a stick, right? So if you remember your trigonometry from high school, right? If I give you either 3 angles or 3 sides, you can only make 1 triangle, or 2 sides, 1 angle, 2 angles, 1 side. You know what I mean? You can only make 1 triangle. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to use that, like trigonometry, to figure out what the overall shape of our bracket needs to be, right? So I made an imaginary point 3/4 of an inch below the mounting hole I want to use on the firewall, and I measured from that point to the bottom of bracket A, from the same point to the top of bracket A, and then the distance between the 2 holes on bracket A. So that gives me, in my case, 9 3/4, 12 and 4. So if I use something to make up that triangle, it'll give me an overall shape of what my bracket needs to be. So let me show you what I mean. So again, you want to use something that's relatively straight and affordable and easy to work with, so I used coat hanger wire. Just happened to be what I had on hand. So I've reproduced my 4 measurements, right? I have 9 3/4, 12, and 4. So if I try to rearrange these, I will get one triangle. And like it does, if you say, oh yeah, but what if you put them like that? That's still the same triangle, just flip the other way around. If you have 3 given sides, you can always only make 1 triangle. So by putting them in the location where I actually measured them, like so, that gives me a pretty good idea of what my bracket's going to be. Like I said, this is my one imaginary point that was about 3/4 of an inch below where my actual mounting hole was going to be. So if I go another 3/4 of an inch above, that should give me my mounting tab. Now I don't know, like I said, because these are compound angles, I don't know the relationship between this angle and that angle. That could be a little bit more this way or that way, right? So I'm not going to cut the triangle exactly and expect it to fit. I'm going to cut it a little bit bigger, leave myself some space, and then trim it to fit, like make marks and trim it to fit once I know. But at least instead of having to handle a whole sheet of cardboard in there, you've got a rough opening that's pretty close to what you need. And there you have it. So that's our bracket. I'm going to make a couple of cutouts, make it look like a truss, but you get the idea, right? So I don't know if you guys noticed, while we were cutting out, trimming it to size, our trimming was actually pretty darn close to our mathematical guesstimate, right? So hopefully this trick helps you guys out, figure out when you guys are making brackets, save you some time, save you some headache, maybe save you a little bit of material, and it works pretty good. So now all we got to do is transfer this guy to metal.
A little longer than a few minutes later.
Okay, after some tweaking and some modification, and if I'm being honest, a little bit of off-camera crying, I did manage to get my electric wipers working. The first issue I ran into was basically my own stupidity. So remember how I had to modify my defrost duct to permit the vacuum motor to swing further ahead. Later down the line, when I wired in the 6-volt converter, I have a 6-volt converter to step the voltage back down to 6 volt. So my stock gauges work with the stock sender and the stock calibration. I went and mounted it to the back of that dash bracket, and stupid me, instead of offsetting the bracket towards the passenger side, I made the bracket centered. So that put the converter exactly where the defrost duct used to be. So the first thing that happened when I tried my electric wipers, the arm crashed into that bracket. So that was an easy enough fix. I just removed the bracket, welded some standoff, some legs on it, so it would actually be further towards the firewall, give it clearance that I needed. So that worked. And then the second issue I ran into is, wouldn't you know it, my switch actually has a little block underneath with all the terminals for all the different speeds. And the arm would just barely hit that block on the way by. So then I thought, easy enough, just bend it inward, but then it crashed into the e-brake bracket, which was one of the first problems we ran into. So after looking at it a little bit, I knew my angle was a little bit downward like I wanted. So I figured maybe if I cheat that angle a little bit, I can get away with it. So I drilled some holes closer in, tried it again, managed to get it working, cut my arm a little bit shorter, and I got it to work. So let me bring you guys in closer so you can see it in operation. Okay, so hopefully you guys can see this as you stare through the spokes of the steering wheel. So key on, low speed, high speed, and no matter where you stop it, it goes back to park. So if you're using this trick to transform the vacuum wipers on, say, an old car or something that has dual wipers, you can modify both vacuum wipers, and as long as you activate one of them, you can use the stock linkage to run both of them. Which, in retrospect, I could have actually done this in this truck, maybe made my life easier. Because some F1s actually had dual wipers. So I could have actually mounted the electric motor on the passenger side, made the glove box a lot shallower and mount it somewhere over there. And there's a little arm on the vacuum lever here that's originally meant to run the wiper on the other side. So I could have ran off of that with a very small cam and a very long linkage. That might have been a way to do it, but it can work on a car, it can work on a truck. So that's it for this part of the build, thank God. And I'll see you next time in the garage.